Welcome back to the deep dive. We're really getting into some interesting stuff with this NDPR deep dive. We've got through those first few modules now, like the intro and the compliance, right? All that good stuff, getting a good foundation. And now I'm really excited for module 4 because this is where it feels like we get into the kind of the real nitty-gritty, the practical side, the stuff that companies are actually doing.
Yeah.
So welcome back. And I'm also really excited to be talking with our expert on this module. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. Excited to dig into this with you.
Yeah, so this is data protection audits and breach management. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of getting the feeling that this is where like the theory meets the road.
Exactly.
We're really going to see what companies are doing.
Exactly. So we've talked about the principles, we've talked about all the legal framework. Now this is like okay, so what? What are companies actually doing to comply, and how does this actually look in practice?
Yeah. And I think for our listeners who have gone through those first 3 modules, they're going to have a good understanding of like the foundation of this.
Yeah.
And now they can really start to think about, okay, how does this apply to me, to my business, to, the real world?
Exactly.
So let's jump into it then. Let's start with those data protection audits, because that's the first sort of, section in this module. And, when I think about audits, I'm always thinking like, finances.
Great.
Am I on the right track here? Is this kind of like that, but for data?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. So imagine, you're a company and NITDA, comes knocking. And they want to see, okay, how are you actually handling this data that you say you're protecting? What measures do you have in place? How are you actually doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing?
Okay, yeah.
So it's really kind of that check-in.
And so for someone like me, going through these modules, I remember from the earlier modules that audits are mandatory. But help me out, like when exactly does a company need to undergo this? Like when does NITDA come knocking?
Yeah, so the NDPR mandates audits for any organization that's handling the personal data of over 2,000 individuals. So if you're a company that's dealing with a large amount of data, that's kind of the threshold.
Okay, all right, so 2,000 or more, you're getting an audit.
Yep.
And I know there's a filing fee involved, right, to do this whole thing?
There is. So if you're handling the data of, let's say, less than 2,000 people, it's 10,000. But if you're 2,000 or more, it's 20,000.
Okay.
And that's just kind of like an administrative fee to, help NITDA with all the processing.
All right, so let's imagine NITD is knocking on the door now. What are they going to want to see? What goes into one of these reports to prove that you're doing everything right?
So essentially, they want to see a really detailed picture of what you're doing with the data. So first of all, what kind of data are you collecting? Where are you getting it from? How are you storing it? What kind of security measures do you have in place to make sure that it's safe? And then they also want to know, okay, what kind of training have you given your employees? Because we all know human error can be a huge factor in data breaches and things like that.
So they're really trying to get like a full, like a data map almost, like to understand where's the data coming from? How are you using it? Where is it being stored? And who has access to it and all that good stuff.
And how are you making sure that the people who have access to it know how to handle it properly?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
So it's really that full picture.
And I imagine, too, like any past breaches or anything like that, you'd have to disclose all that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to be completely transparent. If there has been any incidents in the past, you need to say what happened, how you dealt with it, and what you've done to prevent it from happening again.
Okay, so this sounds like a lot of work. Who's responsible for putting all this together? Is this like a DIY project, or is there someone, who can help with this?
So you're not going to be able to just, do this yourself. There are actually certified professionals who are licensed by NITDA to do these audits, and they're called Data Protection Compliance Organizations, or DPCOs for short.
At DPCO, so they're like the data protection specialists.
Exactly. So they're kind of like the auditors, the detectives who come in and really make sure that you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing.
Okay, so they come in and they do the audit, and then they provide this report to NITDA.
They do, and they actually have to vouch for it too, so they have to provide a statement saying that they believe that the audit was conducted properly and that the information is accurate.
Okay, so it's not just like, here's a report and, take our word for it.
Exactly. There's accountability there.
Yeah.
They're putting their stamp of approval on it.
So what happens, let's say a DPCO uncovers some serious shortcomings during an audit? What are the consequences for the company? Like, what happens next?
Well, the first thing is that the DPCO is going to point out, where you need to improve. They'll give you recommendations. It's not just about, getting in trouble. It's about, okay, how can you actually do this better?
Okay.
But of course, if a company is just completely ignoring the NDPR and they're not taking any steps to comply, then NITDA can come in and, impose fines or other penalties.
Yeah.
So it's really in everyone's best interest to take this seriously.
And, talking about the DPCOs, they have a big responsibility here.
Yeah.
This is not just about ticking boxes. It's also about, upholding these ethical standards,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
There's a lot of, trust involved in this whole process.
Exactly. So there are ethical guidelines that DPCOs have to follow.
Okay, and can you give some examples of like what those might look like?
Yeah. So one of the big ones is conflict of interest. So a DPCO can't, for example, audit their best friend's company or, a company that they have a close relationship with.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
They have to be independent and they have to be objective.
Yeah.
And another big one is confidentiality.
Oh, right.
So everything that's discussed during an audit is completely confidential. It's kind of like, doctor-patient confidentiality.
Okay.
So you want to make sure that, companies feel comfortable being open and honest with the DPCO, knowing that that information is not going to be shared.
Yeah, makes sense. So I'm curious, can a company just decide to, skip hiring a DPCO and just kind of do a self-audit? Is that something that's allowed under the NDPR?
That's a great question. And, it might seem tempting to try to save some money and do it yourself, but the NDPR actually specifically prohibits self-audits.
Oh,
They really want that independent, unbiased assessment.
Right. So you can't mark your own homework, basically. Okay. So we've talked about, the who, the what, the why of these audits, but, data breaches are a reality. They happen. So how do these audits tie into, managing and mitigating those risks? How does that all play together?
I think audits are a really important preventative measure because if you think about it, you're identifying those vulnerabilities and you're hopefully fixing them before a breach even happens.
Right.
So you're kind of getting ahead of it.
Yeah.
And you're reducing the likelihood of those really bad scenarios happening in the first place.
Okay. So it's like getting regular maintenance on your car.
Yeah.
It's better to fix that small oil leak now than to wait for the engine to blow up on the highway.
Exactly.
All right, so it sounds like those audits are really important for kind of heading off those issues before they even arise.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So,
But of course, sometimes things happen even when you take all the right precautions.
Right.
Systems fail, hackers get really creative, and breaches do happen.
okay, so
So we need to talk about that too.
let's talk about those oh no moments then. Let's dive into that a little bit because
Yeah.
I'm already feeling a little bit anxious thinking about these situations. So, for our listeners who have been following along, diligently with these modules, remind us what exactly constitutes a data privacy breach under the NDPR.
Okay, so a data privacy breach, it can be any unauthorized access to data, disclosure, alteration, destruction. So basically, it's any situation where that personal information is compromised in a way that violates the NDPR.
So it's not just about like hackers stealing credit card numbers. It could be something as simple as accidentally emailing, like a spreadsheet with customer details to the wrong person.
Exactly.
That would be considered a breach.
That's a breach, yeah. So it could be something, sophisticated, like a cyber attack, or it could be something, as you said, an accident, human error.
Okay.
The point is, if that data is compromised, it's a breach.
Okay, so let's say the unthinkable happens. A company does experience a breach. What are the immediate steps they need to take? Like what's the first things that need to happen?
So the clock starts ticking as soon as you become aware of that breach.
Yeah.
You have 72 hours to report it to NITDA.
72 hours. That's not a lot of time.
No.
Especially when you're, in a panic situation.
It's a tight deadline.
Yeah. So what's the top priority, like in that initial time frame? What needs to happen?
So the first thing is containment. You've got to stop the bleeding, basically. Shut down the affected systems, change passwords, maybe even disconnect from the internet.
Oh, wow.
Whatever you need to do to limit the damage and stop any further access to the data.
Okay, so that's step one. You're trying to just
Contain it,
contain it. Yeah.
isolate it.
Yeah, like quarantine it.
Exactly.
Okay, so once you've kind of stopped the bleeding, so to speak.
Right.
What's next?
Then you need to figure out, okay, how bad is it? What happened?
Mm.
And that's the impact assessment. So that's where you put on your detective hat and you say, okay, what data was actually compromised? How many people are affected? What are the risks to those individuals?
Oh,
So it's not just about reporting to NITDA, it's about actually understanding what happened.
and then
Yeah.
is there also a requirement to notify the individuals whose data was affected?
So that depends. If the breach is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, then yes, you have to tell them.
So, like, if it's really sensitive information, like financial data or
Yeah.
healthcare records,
Yeah.
then you've got to let those people know directly.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of sending out a mass email to everyone.
No, it needs to be tailored to the specific situation.
Right.
And it needs to be clear and easy to understand.
Okay.
And it needs to tell people what they can do to protect themselves.
Okay, so reporting and notification, that's just the first step. What comes after that? What are some of the longer-term strategies that companies should be thinking about to prevent future breaches and just, strengthen their data protection overall?
So breach management isn't just about reacting to an incident. It's about learning from it and making changes to prevent it from happening again.
Okay.
And that's what we call remediation.
Okay.
So you want to figure out, okay, what was the root cause of this breach? Was it a technical vulnerability? Was it a process issue? Was it human error? And then you address that root cause.
So it's not just about fixing the problem.
Right.
It's about understanding why it happened in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, and then taking steps so that it doesn't happen again.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you might need to implement stronger security measures. You might need to update your data handling policies, maybe provide more training to your employees.
And speaking of employees, I imagine, their role in all of this is pretty crucial. Because even if you have all the fancy security systems in place, one careless mistake from someone on the inside could really lead to a major issue.
Yeah, so employee training and awareness is really important. You need to make sure everyone in your company understands the NDPR, they understand why data protection is important, and they know what their responsibilities are.
Okay, so regular training sessions, clear guidelines,
Yep.
maybe even like simulated phishing exercises and things like that
Absolutely.
to kind of, test their awareness.
Yeah. You want to create a culture of data protection. It's not just about the technology, it's about the people too.
Okay, so we've gone from containment to impact assessment to, remediation. Is there any final piece of advice you'd want to offer to companies that are, trying to navigate this complex world of data breach management?
I think the biggest thing is to be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for a breach to happen. Get those security measures in place, do those audits, train your employees, have a plan in place for what you're going to do if something does happen.
Okay, so it's like hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Exactly. Breaches are a serious threat, but they don't have to be a disaster.
Right.
If you're prepared.
Okay.
So take it seriously, build it into your company culture,
Yeah.
and you'll be much better off.
Now, understanding all the, the intricacies of this is important, but I think it would also be helpful for our listeners to hear about some real-world examples of how these breaches have played out in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific cases that you can share that would, really highlight the importance of taking this seriously?
Yeah.
I think hearing those real-life stories can really, hit home for people.
Oh, absolutely. It's like those cautionary tales we heard growing up, right? They stick with you.
They do.
So, yeah, I've got some stories that I think will really illustrate this point.
Okay, let's hear them.
So one that comes to mind is there was a major Nigerian bank that had a pretty significant cyber attack back in 2021.
Oh, okay. This is already making me want to check my online banking security. What happened?
So hackers managed to get into their systems, and they accessed a lot of sensitive customer data, account numbers, transaction history, even contact details. It was pretty bad.
That's a nightmare for the bank and for the customers, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
What was the fallout from that? Like, what happened?
So the bank, they had a lot of negative publicity, obviously. People lost trust in them. It damaged their reputation quite a bit. And of course, there were financial consequences.
Oh, I bet.
NITDA was not happy.
Yeah.
So they ended up getting fined $10 million
Wow.
for violating the NDPR. They didn't have adequate security measures.
Yeah.
And they didn't report the breach on time. So
Yeah.
it was a costly lesson for them.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But it does show that, NITDA means business.
Yeah, they're serious.
This isn't just,
It's not a suggestion.
a suggestion. Yeah, these are real consequences.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so any other examples that come to mind that might be helpful for people to hear?
Yeah, so there was another case involving a healthcare institution, and this one, their patient database was actually left exposed online because of weak security configurations.
Oh, wow.
So, all those medical records, all that sensitive information,
Yeah.
it was just out there.
That's scary. Like
Yeah,
that's really sensitive information.
very sensitive.
What happened? Like what was the result of that?
So, thankfully, they were able to secure the database quickly and prevent any further unauthorized access. But the damage was done.
Yeah.
They faced a lot of backlash from patients, from privacy advocates. It really highlighted how important it is to prioritize data security, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as medical records.
These are great examples, and it really does bring it home that this is happening here in Nigeria. These aren't just theoretical threats; these are real things,
Exactly.
and the consequences can be really significant
Yeah,
for everyone involved.
absolutely.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about audits, we talked about breaches, we've heard some real, you know, cautionary tales here.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways? Like, what do you want our listeners to really walk away with from this conversation?
I think the most important thing is that data protection is not just about checking boxes. It's about doing what's right. It's about protecting people's information.
Yeah.
It's about building trust.
It's about seeing data as a responsibility,
Yes,
not just an asset.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the NDPR is really a framework to help us do all of that.
Okay, well said.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into data protection audits and breach management. We hope this has been, insightful and helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, the journey doesn't end here. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep those firewalls strong.
Exactly.
That's some good advice.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for listening. And until next time, stay data secure.
See you next time. It's
Ah,
like, it really is like that, you're getting that regular checkup, you're making sure everything's running smoothly.
right, yeah.
But, even with the best preventative measures, sometimes those unexpected things happen, like, you know, systems crash or hackers find new ways in,
Right.
and unfortunately, breaches do occur.
Okay, so let's talk about those like oh no moments then. Let's dive into that a little bit because I'm already feeling a little anxious just thinking about it. So for our listeners who have been following along, diligently through these modules, remind us what exactly constitutes a data privacy breach under the NDPR?
So a data privacy breach, it's really any unauthorized access, disclosure, alteration, or destruction of that personal data. So it's any situation where that information is compromised in a way that, violates the NDPR.
So it's not just about like hackers stealing credit card numbers. It could be something as simple as, accidentally emailing a spreadsheet with customer details to the wrong person.
Exactly. Yeah, it could be something, very sophisticated like a cyber attack, or it could be, as you said, just a simple human error, an accident.
Right.
But the point is, if that data is compromised, that's a breach.
Okay, so let's say the unthinkable happens, company experiences a breach. What are the immediate steps they need to take? What needs to happen?
So as soon as you become aware of the breach, the clock starts ticking. You have 72 hours to report it to NITDA.
72 hours. That's not a lot of time.
It's a tight deadline.
Especially when you're, probably panicking
Yeah,
in that situation.
yeah.
So what's the top priority in that initial time frame?
Containment.
Yeah.
You have to stop the bleeding, essentially. Shut down the affected systems, change passwords, maybe even disconnect from the internet entirely.
Wow.
Whatever you need to do to just limit the damage and prevent any further access to that data.
Okay, so you're trying to just isolate it, like quarantine it almost.
Exactly. Yeah. Contain it, isolate it.
Okay, and then once you've kind of stopped the bleeding, so to speak, what's next?
Okay. So now you need to figure out, okay, how bad is it? What actually happened? And that's what we call the impact assessment.
Okay.
So now you put on your detective hat and you say, all right, what data was compromised? How many people are affected? What are the risks to those individuals?
Okay, so it's not just about reporting to NITDA.
Right.
It's about really understanding the scope of what happened.
Exactly. You need to understand what happened
Yeah.
before you can really move forward.
Okay, and then is there also a requirement to notify the individuals whose data was affected?
So that depends on the situation. If it's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, then yes, you have to notify them directly.
So like if it's really sensitive information, like financial data or health records, things like that,
Exactly.
you've got to let those people
You
know.
have to let them know.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of sending out like a general email blast.
No, it needs to be tailored to the specific situation. It needs to be clear, easy to understand,
Right.
and it needs to tell people what they can do to protect themselves.
Okay, so reporting and notification, that's just the first step. What comes after that? Like, what are some of the longer-term strategies that companies should be thinking about
Yeah.
to prevent future breaches and, strengthen their data protection overall?
Yeah, so breach management, it's not just about reacting to the incident, it's about learning from it
Right.
and making changes to prevent it from happening again.
Okay.
And that's what we call remediation. So you want to figure out, okay, what was the root cause? Was it a technical vulnerability? Was it a process issue? Was it human error?
Right.
And then you address that root cause.
So it's not just about fixing the problem. It's about understanding why it happened.
Exactly.
Okay.
And making sure it doesn't happen again.
Okay. And so I imagine that might involve things like implementing stronger security measures.
Yeah, it could be, updating your policies, providing more training to employees.
Right. And speaking of employees, I imagine, their role in all of this is pretty crucial.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're a huge part of this.
Because even if you have all the, the fancy security systems and everything, one careless mistake from someone on the inside
One little mistake
could really lead to a major issue.
could bring the whole thing down.
Yeah.
So yeah, employee training and awareness, that's really key.
Okay.
You need to make sure everyone in your company understands the NDPR. They understand why data protection is important, and they know what their responsibilities are.
Okay. So regular training sessions, clear guidelines, maybe even like simulated phishing exercises and things like that
Yes.
to kind of test their awareness.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to create that culture of data protection. It's not just about the technology, it's about the people.
All right. So we've gone from, containment to impact assessment to remediation.
Mhm.
Is there any final piece of advice you'd want to offer to companies who are, trying to navigate this often complex world of data breach management?
I think the biggest piece of advice I can give is be proactive, not reactive.
Okay.
So don't wait for a breach to happen. Get those security measures in place, do those audits, train your employees, have a plan in place for what you're going to do if something does happen.
Okay. So it's hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Data breaches are a serious threat, but they don't have to be a disaster
Ah.
if you're prepared.
If you're prepared.
So take it seriously, build it into your company culture,
Yeah.
and you'll be much better off.
Now, understanding all of the, the intricacies of this is important. But I think it would also be really helpful for our listeners to hear some real-world examples of how these breaches have played out in Nigeria. Do you have any specific cases you can share that would, really highlight the importance of taking this seriously? I think hearing those real-life stories can really hit home for people.
Oh, absolutely. It's like those cautionary tales, we heard growing up. They really stick with you.
They do. They do.
So yeah, I've got a couple of stories that I think really illustrate this point.
Okay, let's hear them.
Okay, so one that comes to mind is there was a leading Nigerian bank that had a pretty significant cyber attack back in 2021.
Oh, okay. This is already making me want to double-check my own online banking security. What happened?
Well, hackers got into their systems.
Okay.
And they were able to access a lot of sensitive customer data, account numbers, transaction history, even contact details.
That's nightmare for the bank and obviously for their customers as well.
Well, it was bad news.
So what was the fallout from that? Like what happened?
Well, there was a lot of negative publicity, obviously. People lost trust in the bank.
Right.
It really damaged their reputation. And then, of course, there were the financial consequences, too.
I bet NITDA was not too happy about this.
Yeah, no, they were not.
So what happened? Did they face any penalties?
Oh, yeah, they got hit with a pretty hefty fine, $10 million for violating the NDPR. They didn't have the right security measures in place, and they didn't report the breach quickly enough. So yeah, it was a tough lesson for them, but
Yeah, it shows that they mean business.
NITDA is serious.
This is not just a suggestion.
This is the law.
Yeah. All right. So any other examples that come to mind that might be helpful for people to hear?
Yeah, I've got another one. This one involves a healthcare institution.
Okay.
And their patient database was actually left exposed online
Oh, wow.
because of some really weak security configurations.
So all those medical records, all that
Yeah.
sensitive information,
All of it, yeah, it was just out there.
that's scary.
Yeah, it was a bad situation.
So what happened? What was the result of that?
So thankfully, they were able to secure the database pretty quickly
Okay.
and prevent any further access. But, the damage was done.
Right. Yeah.
They faced a lot of criticism, from patients, privacy advocates, even regulatory bodies.
I bet. Yeah. I mean, that's really sensitive information,
It is.
people's medical records.
Yeah, and it really shows how important it is to prioritize data security,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as that.
These are great examples. I mean, it really brings it home.
Yeah.
That this is happening here in Nigeria. These aren't just theoretical threats. These are
Okay.
real things. And the consequences can be really significant
Absolutely.
for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about audits, we talked about breaches, we've heard some cautionary tales. Yeah, we have. What are the key takeaways? What do you want our listeners to really walk away with from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is that data protection, it's not just about checking boxes. It's not just about complying with the law.
Right.
It's about doing the right thing. It's about respecting people's information.
It's about seeing data as a responsibility.
Exactly.
Not just an asset to be exploited.
Yeah, and I think the NDPR, it really provides a framework for all of that.
Okay, well said.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into data protection audits and breach management. We hope this has been insightful and helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, the journey doesn't end here. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep those firewalls strong.
Exactly.
Some great advice.
You got it.
All right, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay data secure.
See you later.